For decades, the dream ran one way: Americans crossing an ocean to stand in front of something older than their own country. That direction has quietly reversed. Right now, across 7 British cities, people are selling everything and building a life in America with no plan to return. The strange part isn't that it's happening, it's why.
My ancestors will not like me for saying this, but there are things America does that are better than the UK.
I don't really know what I was expecting to feel, but when we landed and we were driving through the familiar streets of where I'm from, I didn't feel like it was home. I didn't feel like I was home, I just felt like it was familiar.
I've come back to the UK and it's boring!
I'm flying back to LA today and I just can't stop crying. I don't want to go. I had such an amazing trip. I've met so many amazing people. I felt so loved, obviously with my mom. It's been so good, and I don't want to leave.
Because the reason isn't excitement, or glamour, or anything you'd see on a postcard. It's something quieter. Something you already live inside of and have probably never once noticed. A paycheck that isn't cut in half before it reaches you. A house with room to breathe. A doctor's appointment that happens this month, not next year. These are structural reasons. And once you see the machinery behind them, an entire generation quietly voting with its feet stops looking strange and starts looking obvious. 7 cities, 7 different reasons. A tax system, a housing market, a hospital list, a stadium, a shipyard that no longer exists. Each one alone looks like coincidence. By the last city, the pattern will be impossible to unsee. Let's start where this story always seems to start. The city that convinced the world it could never lose anyone. London has spent a century convincing the world that ambition gets rewarded here. That if you are smart enough and you work hard enough, this city will eventually make room for you. So why are the very people it depends on most, the young engineers writing the code behind its banks, its trading floors, its tech startups, quietly packing up and leaving? The answer isn't ambition, it's arithmetic. In Zone 2 and Zone 3, rent now consumes more than 60% of a skilled engineer's after-tax income before a single bill or grocery run is paid. Between 1997 and 2024, the ratio of house prices to average income more than doubled. Owning a home before 40 has gone from a milestone to something closer to a rumor. And the tax system doesn't soften the blow, it tightens it, taking a growing share of every raise before it ever reaches a bank account. This isn't bad luck, it's design. Britain's housing scarcity is largely a planning problem. Decades of tightly restricted land release, protected green belt zones, and a construction pace that has never come close to matching demand in and around the capital. When supply is capped by policy rather than geography, price isn't a market signal anymore. It's a ceiling, and ambition, no matter how talented, cannot out-earn a ceiling that rises faster than any salary can climb. Now picture the same engineer's ledger, redrawn in Texas. 0 personal income tax, not a lower rate, a flat 0. Land that was never rationed the way London's has been, so a family can trade a cramped 1-bedroom rental for a detached house with a yard and a pool, often for less than what London rent alone would cost. It isn't a lifestyle upgrade so much as a different operating system for the same working life. One where a paycheck actually behaves the way it looks on paper. What's quietly remarkable is that no one had to sell these engineers on the idea of America. They ran the numbers themselves, one spreadsheet at a time, and the spreadsheet did the convincing. That's the part London has never fully reckoned with. You can build the most prestigious financial center in the world and still lose the people who make it run, if living inside your own success has become mathematically unsustainable. Money, though, is only the first thing people notice they're missing. The second thing takes longer to name, because it isn't in a bank statement. It shows up in something as ordinary as a weather forecast 400 miles north in a city that built an entire economy and somehow forgot to build in the sun. Manchester built one of the most powerful regional economies in Britain, a city of finance, universities, and a media industry that rivals London's. So why do so many of its most capable people describe the place not with pride, but with exhaustion, as if success here comes with a hidden tax no spreadsheet ever shows? The number tells part of it, 139 days of rain a year, more than 1 in 3 days on the calendar. But the real cost isn't the umbrella. It's what prolonged, low-light winters do to a nervous system that was never designed to run on artificial light for half the year. Seasonal affective disorder isn't a mood. It's a measurable dip in serotonin regulation. And Manchester's latitude and cloud cover put it squarely in the zone where that dip becomes chronic rather than occasional. This isn't simply bad weather. It's an inherited urban blueprint. Manchester, like most of industrial-era Britain, was built around factories, terraced housing, and dense city blocks laid out for production, not for daylight. Narrow streets, tight roof lines, buildings oriented for proximity to work rather than exposure to sun. 2 centuries later, the descendants of that layout still live inside it, in a climate that offers little light to begin with, and an urban form that blocks out what little exists. The exhaustion people feel isn't only about the sky. It's about inheriting a city that was never designed with sunlight as a variable worth solving for. Now compare that to a place built almost entirely around the opposite premise. In South Florida, urban planning treats sunlight as infrastructure, open lot sizes, low-density sprawl, entire industries built around outdoor living, tourism, and a service economy that runs 12 months a year instead of shutting down for a British winter. It isn't just that Miami gets more sun, it's that the whole economic model downstream of that sun, hospitality, real estate, outdoor recreation, was built to capture it. The way Manchester's model was built to capture manufacturing output. What people moving from Manchester to South Florida describe isn't a vacation feeling. It's the strange, almost disorienting experience of energy returning to their body on a random Tuesday, not because life got easier, but because the environment finally stopped working against them. Enduring gray winters had always been framed as a kind of quiet, British virtue, resilience dressed up as character. But resilience against a design flaw isn't the same as strength. Sometimes it's just adaptation to something that was never fixed. Weather, though, is a cost you can eventually leave behind by boarding a plane. Some costs follow you no matter where you fly from, because they're baked into the very system meant to keep you alive. 600 miles north in a city already carrying the weight of a vanished industry, that cost has a name, and it's measured in years, shaved off a lifespan. Glasgow has weathered industrial collapse before and rebuilt itself around finance, universities, and a resurgent art scene. So why does something as basic as getting to see a specialist still feel, for many residents here, like waiting for a verdict rather than an appointment? The scale of it is hard to overstate. Over 7 million people are currently on specialist treatment waiting lists across the UK, with roughly 3 million waiting longer than the standard 18-week benchmark. In Glasgow specifically, that strain lands on a population already dealing with some of the lowest life expectancy figures in Western Europe, a legacy that predates any single policy and traces back to decades of deindustrialization, high rates of chronic illness, and a northern latitude that limits sunlight exposure for much of the year. This isn't a story about one broken system. It's a story about capacity meeting demand in a place that has less of both to work with. A centralized, single-provider healthcare model can deliver enormous efficiencies at scale, but it also means capacity expands slowly. New specialists, new facilities, and new equipment move through a single national pipeline rather than a patchwork of competing regional providers who can each choose to grow independently. When a population's underlying health burden is unusually high, as it is in post-industrial Glasgow, that slower-moving pipeline is asked to absorb pressure it was never sized for. Add a climate that limits the vitamin D synthesis, older residents' need for bone density and immune function, and the wait itself becomes a health risk, not just an inconvenience. Phoenix operates on almost the opposite set of inputs. Arizona's healthcare market is built around competing regional hospital systems that can each expand capacity independently, meaning new specialist clinics, imaging centers, and outpatient surgical facilities can be built wherever demand appears, rather than routed through one central authority. Layer onto that over 300 days of sunlight a year, and you get a rare combination: a climate that actively supports aging bodies sitting on top of a medical infrastructure that was built with room to grow. It's also part of why Phoenix has become a hub for semiconductor manufacturing and advanced medical technology, industries that tend to cluster where healthcare capacity and skilled labor already exist. For people making this move, it rarely feels like chasing luxury. It feels closer to something more basic, refusing to let a slow-moving system decide, by default, how long a treatable condition gets to go untreated. Health, once you start measuring it in waiting list months instead of doctor's visits, stops being an abstract policy debate and starts being the thing that quietly outranks almost every other reason to stay somewhere. But not every reason for leaving is about survival. Some are about something Britain has always taken pride in and slowly let fall behind the rest of the world without quite noticing. 200 miles south of Glasgow, in a city built on football and music, that gap has a very different face. Liverpool gave the world some of its most iconic football clubs and one of its most influential music scenes, a city whose cultural exports are recognized everywhere, from Tokyo to Sao Paulo. So why do the fans who live here, the ones who never left, often describe match day not as a celebration, but as an exercise in patience? The stadiums themselves tell part of the story. Many of Liverpool's most storied grounds sit wedged into dense Victorian-era residential streets, laid out more than a century before anyone imagined what a modern matchday experience could look like. Getting in and out means navigating narrow roads never built for crowds this size, and the surrounding infrastructure, transport links, parking, nearby amenities, was never retrofitted to match the scale of what happens inside those walls 60 times a season. This isn't a failure of passion, it's a mismatch between infrastructure and era. Much of Britain's sports and entertainment infrastructure was built during a period when stadiums were meant to hold a match, not host an experience. No surrounding retail, no integrated transit hubs, no multi-use districts designed to keep revenue circulating in the local economy before and after the final whistle. Because that infrastructure is protected by historic status and hemmed in by residential density, expanding or modernizing it isn't simply expensive. It's often close to physically impossible. The result is a local economy that captures only a fraction of the value its own passion generates, while fans pay rising prices for an experience that hasn't fundamentally changed in decades. Las Vegas represents the opposite starting point entirely. Allegiant Stadium and the arenas built around it weren't retrofitted into an existing city. They were designed from the ground up as part of a broader entertainment ecosystem, with parking, transit, hospitality, and year-round event programming built in from day one. A single event here isn't 90 minutes of football. It's a full economic engine. Ticket revenue, tourism spending, hospitality jobs, and a live entertainment industry that runs 52 weeks a year instead of one football season. For people moving from Liverpool into this world, the pull usually isn't disloyalty to the game they grew up loving. It's the discovery that the same passion in a different piece of infrastructure can generate careers in event management, hospitality, live production that simply don't exist at scale back home. Liverpool taught the world how to love football. It just never quite built the stadium that could keep up with that love. Infrastructure is one kind of inheritance a city hands down without asking. Opportunity is another, and in one English seaside town, that inheritance has calcified into something closer to a closed door than an open one. Sunderland once built more ships than almost any city on Earth, a name synonymous with heavy industry, skilled labor, and generational pride passed from father to son on the same shipyard floor. So why, decades after that industry vanished, do young people here still describe their choices as either accept or leave, with almost nothing in between? The shipyards are gone, and what replaced them never fully closed the gap. An automotive assembly plant remains, but it employs a fraction of the workforce the old industry once did, and it can't absorb the volume of skilled labor a post-shipbuilding generation still produces. What's left is a narrow set of outcomes: low-wage service work with little room for advancement, or watching hard-earned technical skills slowly lose relevance inside buildings that haven't been meaningfully modernized in a generation. This isn't a story about effort or talent. It's a story about how difficult it is for a local economy to pivot once it has been built around a single industry for over a century. Skills, infrastructure, even the layout of the city itself were optimized for shipbuilding, specialized training pipelines, supply chains, an entire local labor market calibrated to one thing. When that thing disappears, there's no simple substitute waiting to absorb the same workforce with the same skills at the same wage. The city isn't short on capability. It's short on an economy built to use it. Charlotte offers something structurally different. A metro area that became the second largest banking and financial center in the United States, not by replacing one industry with another, but by deliberately diversifying. Finance, logistics, energy, and corporate headquarters all growing alongside each other rather than depending on a single sector. That diversification means a downturn in one industry doesn't strand an entire generation the way it did in Sunderland. Add genuinely affordable homeownership, and a skilled worker isn't just finding a job. They're finding a local economy resilient enough that this kind of collapse is far less likely to happen to them twice. For someone leaving Sunderland, the move rarely feels like abandoning identity. It feels like transferring hard-won technical skill into an economy actually built to keep using it. The shipyards gave Sunderland its pride. They just never left behind an economy diverse enough to survive without them. Not every closed door is economic, though. Sometimes, the ceiling isn't a lack of jobs. It's something built into the walls of the city itself before you were even born. Oxford is arguably the most recognized center of learning on Earth. A name that opens doors, commands respect, and has produced more Nobel laureates and heads of state than almost any institution in history. So why do so many of the researchers and academics who built that reputation quietly admit they can't afford to live near the university that made them? The math here is almost absurd. Oxford consistently ranks among the least affordable cities in England relative to local income, with house prices running many multiples of what researchers and educators actually earn. PhD candidates, postdoctoral researchers, and early career academics, people whose CVs would open doors anywhere in the world, routinely live in cramped shared rentals, watching a stipend or junior salary disappear into rent before it ever has the chance to become savings. Prestige, it turns out, is not a currency landlords accept. This isn't a personal failure of financial planning. It's a structural mismatch between where prestige accumulates and where money does. British university funding has historically prioritized preserving institutional reputation and research output over competitive compensation for the people producing that output. A model that assumes talent will stay for the name on the building rather than the number on the paycheck. Combine that with a housing market shaped by the same restrictive land use planning found across southern England, and you get a city where intellectual capital is abundant, but financial capital, the kind that actually builds a life, is scarce. Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts, run on a fundamentally different funding architecture. Home to Harvard, MIT, and the largest biotech research cluster in the world, the region has built a tight, well-financed pipeline between university research and commercial application, patents, startups, and licensing deals that let academic breakthroughs generate real revenue, some of which flows back to the researchers themselves. Add substantially larger research grants and industry salaries that compete directly with the private sector, and the same scientist who could barely save money in Oxford can build both a career and a financial foundation in Boston, often working on the very same research questions. For those who make the move, it rarely feels like betraying the pursuit of knowledge. It feels like relocating that pursuit somewhere it can finally support a life, not just a title. Oxford taught the world how to think. It just never quite built a system that let its own thinkers afford to stay and keep thinking there. Some gaps are about money reaching the people who earn it. The last one is about something more basic still, whether the very ground a city sits on leaves any room to grow at all. Portsmouth built the ships that once made Britain the most powerful naval force on Earth, a city so central to the Royal Navy's identity that for centuries its fortunes and the nation's were treated as one and the same. So why does a city with that kind of historical weight behind it now feel, to many of the people who grew up there, less like a place with a future and more like a place with a ceiling? Start with the geography. Because in Portsmouth's case, the geography isn't a metaphor, it's the actual problem. Portsmouth sits almost entirely on Portsea Island, making it the only true island city in England. That single fact, more than any policy decision or economic downturn, has quietly shaped everything else about how the city works. An island can't annex the land next door the way an inland city can. It can't sprawl outward when housing demand rises, can't widen a road by simply buying the field beside it, can't add a new district when an old one runs out of room. Every square meter of usable land was effectively spoken for generations ago, which means population density in parts of Portsmouth reaches levels more commonly associated with much larger global cities, except without the transit systems, job diversity, or vertical housing stock those larger cities eventually built to cope with it. Layer the economic history on top of that constraint, and the picture sharpens further. For most of the 20th century, an island with limited land wasn't necessarily a liability, as long as the Royal Navy anchored a stable, high-employment economy that didn't require room to expand. But as Britain's naval footprint shrank in the decades following the Cold War, and shipbuilding contracts consolidated into fewer, larger facilities elsewhere, Portsmouth lost the one economic engine that had justified its cramped geography in the first place. What remained was the density, without the industry dense enough to fill it. Residents were left in terraced housing built during the industrial era, with almost no room to expand a family home, start a business that needed physical space, or build the kind of modern infrastructure, wider roads, larger housing stock, logistics capacity that a growing economy typically requires. The only route off the island runs through a handful of congested bridges and a motorway that backs up daily, meaning even commuting for better opportunity elsewhere in southern England comes at a real cost in time and money. Seattle faced a strikingly similar starting condition. A port city hemmed in by water on multiple sides, with a regional economy that once depended almost entirely on timber, shipping, and aircraft manufacturing at Boeing. On paper, Seattle should have hit the same ceiling. What it didn't share with Portsmouth was a single point of failure. When Boeing's fortunes dipped in past decades, the region didn't collapse with it, because Washington State had already begun diversifying into software, aerospace-adjacent engineering, and eventually the technology sector that would produce Microsoft and Amazon. Just as importantly, Seattle's land use policy allowed the city to grow upward and to redevelop underused industrial waterfront into dense, mixed-use neighborhoods, turning geographic constraint into a design challenge to be solved, rather than a ceiling to be accepted. The result is a metro area with global company headquarters, a deep water port still handling significant international trade, and a housing stock that, while expensive, was at least allowed to expand vertically as demand grew. For someone leaving Portsmouth for Seattle, the appeal is rarely about trading one coastal city for another. It's the relief of discovering that a coastal water-bound geography doesn't have to mean a fixed ceiling on how much a city, or a life inside it, is allowed to grow. Portsmouth's limits were written into its shoreline over a century ago. Seattle simply refused to let its shoreline write the same ending twice. 7 cities, 7 different mechanisms, a rent ceiling, a missing light, a waiting list, a half-century gap, a closed door, a reputation that couldn't pay rent, an island that ran out of room. None of them, on their own, would look like much, but taken together, they stop looking like coincidence and start looking like a pattern, one where the deciding factor was never talent or work ethic or love of home. It was whether the system underneath a person's daily life was actually built to let them grow, or was quietly built to contain them. Maybe the harder question isn't why they left. It's whether the place you're sitting in right now was built to grow with you, or was simply built and left waiting for you to notice the difference. 7 cities, 7 very different reasons. A rent ceiling, a missing light, a waiting list, a half-century gap, a closed door, a reputation that couldn't pay rent, an island that ran out of room. None of them started as a story about America being better. Each one started as an ordinary person doing ordinary math. Rent against income, a doctor's weight against a diagnosis, a shipyard against a future that no longer existed, and arriving almost reluctantly at the same answer. What's strange is how quiet the whole thing has been. There was no single announcement, no policy that made headlines, no moment anyone could point to and say this is when it started. Just thousands of individual decisions made privately, in kitchens and on laptops late at night, that happen to add up to the same direction. That's usually how the most significant shifts move, not as an event, but as a pattern so gradual that by the time you notice it, it has already been happening for years. None of this makes Britain a failed place, and it doesn't make America a perfect one. Every country carries its own version of a rent ceiling, its own waiting list, its own island that ran out of room somewhere. What these 7 stories actually reveal isn't which country wins. It's how much of a person's life, their health, their savings, their sense of forward motion, quietly depends on systems they never chose and rarely think to question until the day the math simply stops working. So maybe the real question isn't about these 7 cities at all. It's about the one you're sitting in right now. What's the ceiling you've stopped noticing because you've lived under it long enough to mistake it for normal?